Hello，大家好。最近呢，有一个中国小伙子关于美国关税战的视频呢，火爆了美国的 TikTok，引起了很多美国人的讨论。有人呢把它转给著名的美国右翼国际关系专家米尔斯海默，请他来评论。我们来看一下视频。
A young Chinese influencer on TikTok who speaks English has made a fascinating clip directed at the American people. And the first time I saw it, I said to Chris, we got to play this for Professor Mearsheimer. We got to have his comments on it. So it's a minute and a half long, but it's in English and it's fascinating. And I want to discuss it with you after we watch it together. Chris, cut number 20.
They rob you blind and you thank them for it. That's a tragedy. That's a scam. That's why I'm saying this right now. Americans, you don't need a tariff. You need a revolution. For decades, your government and oligarchs ship your job to China, not for diplomacy, not for peace, but to exploit cheap labors. And in the process, they hollowed out your middle class, crushed your working class, and taught you to be proud while they sold your future for profit. And yes, China made money, but we used it to build roads, lift millions out of poverty, fund healthcare, raise living standard. We reinvested in our people. My family also benefited from it. What did your oligarchs do? They bought yachts, private jets, and mansions with golf course driveways. They manipulate the market, dodge tax, and poured billions into endless wars. And you get stagnant wages, crippling healthcare costs, cheap dopamine, debt, and flag wave probably made in China while they pick your pocket. For 40 years, both China and the United States benefit from the trade, the manufacturing, but only one of us use that wealth to build. This isn't China's fault. This is yours. You let this happen. You let oligarchs fit your lies while they made you fat, poor, and addicted. Now they blame China for mess they made. I don't think so. I don't think you need another tariff. You need to wake up. You need to take your country back. I think you need a revolution.
The one correction I would make, I realize a lot of this is ideological, is we haven't spent billions on useless wars. We've spent trillions on useless wars. But take it from there, Professor Mearsheimer.
Well, if you listen,
that young man were your student in your class and he stood up and gave that minute and a half statement, how would you respond?
I would tell him I basically agree with him. I think he's correct. And I think, by the way, that this is a message in large part that Trump made as a candidate before the 2016, 2020, and the 2024 election. And it's what helped get him elected in two of those three cases. I think there are a huge number of people in this country who feel exactly the way that Chinese gentleman feels about what has happened.
How I found very attractive what the young man said, and I wish that Donald Trump would listen to it. I don't know what the neocons around him would say. I really don't think that the tariffs were well thought out. I think they were a product of his, at times, pugnacious personality rather than a deep-seated understanding of economics 101. I mean, our colleague, with whom we agree most of the times, I know the two of you have debated, Jeff Sachs agrees entirely. I haven't played this clip for him. We didn't have it when Jeff was on this week, but I suspect he would agree.
中国小伙子的观点呢，其实代表了很多中国人的朴素观点，只不过呢，他用精炼的英文表达了出来。这里呢，米尔斯海默故意在混淆概念，他只承认了问题的前半段，然后故意呢把它等同于川普3次竞选的政见，说明呢他跟川普呢是一样的，都是认为解决美国内部的问题要靠打败美国的敌人。如果美国没有敌人了，美国的问题就解决了。而实际上，中国小伙子的重点呢在于美国的问题存在于美国内部，而解决之道呢是美国内部的革命。美国现实的荒谬之处就在于，支持川普的人呢是为了解决美国的问题，但是选出了川普呢，反而却代表了寡头富人们的利益。就像短片里中国小伙子说的，美国的问题呢是寡头们剥削抢劫了美国人民，摧毁了美国的制造业和中产阶级。川普一方面承诺要重建美国制造业，一方面呢又要给美国富人减税。这种互相矛盾的立场呢，说明只有一个是真的，而另外一个呢就是骗人的。巧合的呢是米尔斯海默的老朋友，也是长期的对手杰弗瑞萨克斯，最近呢也在另一个论坛上发表了关于川普关税战的看法，我们也来听一听。
If you take your credit card and you go shopping, and you run up a large credit card debt, you're running a trade deficit with all those shops. Now, it would be pretty strange if you then blamed all the shop owners for having sold you all those things. You're ripping me off, you're ripping me off, you're ripping me off, I'm running a trade deficit. That is the level of understanding of the President of the United States. The trade deficit does not represent at all trade policies. It represents spending relative to production or earnings. We call that an identity. I teach it in the second day of my course in international monetary economics. Trump never made it to the second day. The US government spends about $2 trillion a year more than it takes in revenues. What it's doing is making transfers to the American people and to American businesses. It doesn't tax Americans for those transfers because, here's another little fact, because the congressmen that vote on the budget got into office by being paid for their campaigns by rich people who don't like taxes. So the political system says spend, but don't tax us. So we run a chronic deficit in the United States. That spending goes out either as transfer payments or goods and services, and that's more than our national income, which is about $30 trillion, and our spending is about $31 trillion. And that's our trade deficit. And for that, Donald Trump blames the world. Okay, I fail him for this if he were my student. He's my president. It's a little weirder because when he did this, in 2 days, the world lost $10 trillion of market capitalization. By the way, where did it go? Did it get transferred from here to here? No, it got destroyed. Why destroyed? Because trade, something also the President of the United States doesn't understand, is mutually beneficial. So if you stop trade, everybody loses. It's not that one side wins, the other side loses. He cannot understand that concept as a guy that traded real estate in New York. So his idea is somebody had to win, somebody had to lose. But what happened when he made this announcement was $10 trillion was wiped out worldwide. It's not that the US went up and they went down. No, everybody went down because the whole world system is based on a division of labor, and he's breaking that division of labor into pieces. So then people said, this doesn't make sense. Even the very rich people that gave him the money for him to get into office started saying this doesn't make sense. The hedge fund managers who were his big campaign contributors, Elon Musk, who paid for his election and became prime minister, he said this doesn't make sense. And then the markets said this doesn't make sense. Not only $10 trillion, but as the finance minister said, interest rates started to rise because people began to dump U.S. Treasury debt. It's not quite true that he reversed things. First, he left on this 10% tariff, except for one country, for China,
145%,
where he raised the tariff rates. That's because the United States has a deep, neurotic attachment to China. The U.S. political system hates China. Why? Because China's big and successful. And so that the U.S. hates. It's a rival, it's a competitor, and so this is the one thing he left on. Now he's going to mess up everything with this too, because in a trade war between the U.S. and China, China wins. China does not depend on the U.S. market very much. It's about 12% of China's exports. China will do just fine. It's just dumb policy. There's no more, sorry to say it, there's just no more explanation to this than that. It makes no sense. We are in one-person rule in the United States. Our political system is in a state of collapse. What President Trump did is an emergency decree. Everything he does is an emergency decree. Literally, you can go on to whitehouse.gov and then follow the menu to executive decrees. And there are dozens of them. And each one starts the same way. With the powers invested in me as President of the United States, I hereby declare A, nonsense, B, nonsense, C, nonsense. Because he's king. Those powers are not invested in the President of the United States. They're invested in the Congress. You read Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution. It says that all duties originate with the Congress. And specifically in the lower house, all legislation has to start in the House of Representatives. But the U.S., starting in 1945 after World War II, became a military state to a large extent. And so it sprinkled in its legislation emergency, emergency, emergency. And Trump doesn't have to prove anything's an emergency, he just has to say something's an emergency. So suddenly the trade deficit became an emergency, and on that basis he issues a one-person rule. Even his aides don't know what he's doing.
首先，第一个观点，特朗普做
米尔斯海默和萨克斯都是现实主义者，区别呢就是一个是公式现实主义，一个是理想现实主义。从萨克斯的谈话来看，西方世界呢，美国不是没有人知道问题的所在，但是这样的人呢，要么是少数，要么呢就默不作声。为什么呢？因为西方文明和中国的区别，归根结底呢，就是一个是游牧文明，一个是农耕文明。而游牧民族解决问题的办法呢，就是靠掠夺抢劫外部资源来给自身补血，而农耕民族呢，都是靠自力更生建设解决自身问题。所以一旦游牧民族失去了掠夺抢劫的能力，往往呢就会从内部崩溃。就像这次的关税战，如果没有中国的挺身而出，美国也就是川普的计划可能就实现了。但是呢，中国顶住了，其他像是欧盟、加拿大也趋于强硬，剩下的大部分国家呢也处于观望。那么川普呢就只剩下两条路了，要么承认关税战失败，要么选择升级到热战。历史上几乎所有的超级帝国都不是被敌人打败的，而是从内部崩溃的。从西方的罗马帝国、埃及、大英帝国，到东方的蒙古、汉朝、唐朝、明朝，解决外部敌人解决不了内部矛盾，也解决不了最终崩溃的命运。中国的小伙子米尔斯海默、萨克斯，其实呢就代表了现实世界的三种观点和解决方法。中国的小伙子呢代表了解决自身问题要靠自己，而米尔斯海默呢代表了利用解决外部问题和敌人来缓解自身问题，而萨克斯呢则代表了合作与共同解决问题。就像是2008年次贷危机，美国呢就是靠着联合全世界和中国创建了 G20 解决了危机。所以这三种道路你觉得谁是对的呢？你觉得未来的美国会走上哪一条道路呢？今天的内容呢就到这里，感谢大家观看今天的视频。如果你觉得这期内容对你有所启发，请点赞、订阅并分享给更多的朋友。另一种视角带你突破认知，我们下期再见，拜拜。